This year, my main goal or big project that I'm working on is turning my backyard into a mini homestead. Starting first with this garden that I am standing in. And on today's video, I'm gonna talk about the best tomato cage that money can buy. Now this is going to be something that you're going to have to build, but it's still going to be the best cage that you can get, well worth your time and effort to put together because they are going to last you for years, a decade plus. Now this is the first garden that I've ever had personally myself, but growing up, I did a lot of gardening with my dad, my family, grew vegetables to sell in a farmer's market. So I'm not new to gardening, but I'm new to gardening on my own. And the cage that I'm going to be talking about is one that I used growing up, the same ones for many, many, many years. So I know for a fact that this cage is going to be one that is going to serve you well. Now there are a few different ways that you can support your tomatoes, and a lot of that comes down to what type of tomatoes you're growing. There are two different types of tomatoes that are the determinate tomatoes or the indeterminate tomatoes. Now indeterminate tomatoes grow to an indeterminate amount of length. They do really well if you trellis them or grow them up a string. So I'm actually doing a few different varieties in my garden for some indeterminate tomatoes. You can see right here, I've got this structure that I found from a YouTuber, the trellis to make you jealous, that I've put in, and I've got several tomatoes that my dad actually started and brought to me. So these are tomatoes that I'm growing on this system. And then over here, I have this cattle panel trellis that I'm mainly growing cucumbers and loofah on, but I have a few sun gold tomatoes that are my wife's favorite that I'm going to be growing up and over this structure. But these are indeterminate tomatoes, vining tomatoes, so they're not something that you typically see in a cage, but you can grow indeterminate tomatoes in a cage. It's what I did growing up. Growing up, I didn't know that there were two different types of tomatoes because we just treated them all the same. We all put them in a cage. Now, if you've ever gone to a big box store at the gardening center and seen some of the cages they have there, you may be tempted to buy those because, you know, they're labeled as tomato cages, provide great support, but they can get pretty expensive. When I was at a local store the other day, just seeing what they had to offer, the cheapest one was $5 or $6, but a lot of them that were, you know, supposed to be bigger and beefier and better were $14, $15 a cage. But those things, they fall apart. They may last you for a season, maybe 2, 3 if you're really lucky, but probably not. You know, those things are junk. They're going to fall apart on you, and they tend to be pretty small. They're not going to support a bigger tomato because even though indeterminate tomatoes can grow to an indeterminate amount of length, you know, they can get 8, 10, 12 feet tall in a garden if well fertilized. They can get really long in a greenhouse hydroponic environment. But for a determinate tomato, even though it grows to a determined amount of size, they can still get up to 5 feet tall. They can get pretty bushy, and those little squat cages aren't going to support a tomato of that size. Now, in preparation of making this video, I wanted to see what other YouTubers were making for their tomato cages to see if they had anything additional that I could learn from. I knew, you know, what type of cage I was going to make, the material that I was going to make it from, but maybe they had something to share. And I have to say, a lot of what I saw, I think is wrong. So first off, when making tomato cages yourself, what I recommend using is concrete reinforcing mesh or wire. Now it can be sold in either a panel. Panels tend to be 8 feet long, or rolls. I recommend using a roll. But first let's talk about what you might see other people doing. A lot of people, when going to make those wire cages, will use galvanized welded wire. Now galvanized welded wire does stay nice and shiny. The concrete reinforcing wire oxidizes, also known as rust, but that's totally fine. But that galvanized wire, one, tends to be more expensive for the given length. It is flimsier, weaker, not as rigid, and the holes are really small. A lot of the stuff that you see has a 2 by 4 inch square. Well, you might be able to weasel your hand in there, but if you're holding a tomato, you're not going to be able to get your hand out of the hole. You need something with a big hole. That's why if you go with concrete reinforcing wire, which has 6 by 6 inch squares, it gives you lots of room to reach in there and hopefully grab those big, giant, beautiful tomatoes that you're gonna be growing. Now right here are the cages that I built yesterday, and I finished off a few today. They don't really show up all that well on camera, but these cages right here, out of a 50-foot roll, I was able to build 8 of them. 8 of them that are about 22 inches in diameter. Now because this is a 6-inch square, if you cut out 11 squares worth, that's going to give you 5.5 feet. When rounded, it'll give you about 22 inches in diameter there. Now this is a great size for a determinate tomato. You could go a little larger, a little bit smaller, but I think this is a really good size. Now these are nice because they are 5 feet tall, but I'll show you a little bit that they're going to end up being a little shorter because you're going to make some supports for them. But I recommend getting the roll because if you got the panels, now an 8-foot one, if you just rounded that up, it's going to be way too big. It's going to be giant. So you're going to have to cut some off, and that cutting it off is going to create waste. So for the amount that you have to buy, you're going to end up spending more money to make the same amount of cages. So get a roll, a 50-foot roll, you can make 8 cages of the size that I made it. Now, when I was talking to my dad about making this video, he lamented about how it used to be way cheaper, and yes, this stuff has gone up in price. I was able to get mine for about $80 for the roll, so these are about $10 a piece, which is, you know, still pretty expensive, especially if you're comparing it to, you know, that $5 one that you can get. But this thing is going to hold up way better than that, even way better than any of those $14 ones. And I think even I've seen online that you can order ones that are like $30, $40, $50 a piece for a tomato cage. That's just absolutely silly. Now, let me give you some safety tips when you're building these cages. When you're rolling out the wire, it's going to want to roll back on itself. So if you're doing it by yourself or even with someone else, you're going to want something to weigh that wire down, because once you cut it, it's going to spring back on itself and can stab you. So be safe, get something heavy to weigh it down. First, I tried to use some 4x4s that I had already had cut that were on my property. Nope, didn't work, not heavy enough. So I had to get some nice cinder blocks and a rock to weigh it down. And you really want 3. This is 3. This is how many 3 is. 3. 1 to weigh down the end, 1 to weigh down the end of what you're going to be cutting, that piece, and the other end that will be now left part of the roll, so it doesn't spring back. Just to keep yourself safe, so you don't have, you know, pointy metal, because that's going to be left, these little tines coming back at you when you're cutting. Wear safety glasses. I cut mine 2 different ways. First, I was using bolt cutters, but the bolt cutters I have really oversized. So if you have smaller bolt cutters, that would be way better. Don't try anything like tin snips. You'll ruin the blade on the tin snips. You could use wire cutters, but you would have to have insane grip strength to be able to get through the wire for this mesh. So bolt cutters worked really well. I tried to use an oscillating cutoff tool, but the wire just chewed through those blades, so didn't work all that well. So bolt cutters are the way to go for cutting your wire. Now, once you cut your wire, it's going to try to roll back up on itself, and there are a few ways that you can secure it to make it into a cage. Now, I've done a few different ways, and I think the way that I like it are the hog rings. But first, let me see if I can grab this one and show you. Okay, so right here, so once you cut it, you'll have the pointy bits that are coming back at you, but you can take those and wrap it around to secure the cage. So this is a good way to do it without requiring an extra tool. Yeah, it takes a little bit of muscle and finagling. None of them are as neat as I would like them to be, but they're perfectly fine. If you're worried about getting poked, you can just throw maybe some electrical tape around them, but it shouldn't be that much of a problem. Worried about tetanus? Always have an up-to-date tetanus shot. good thing to do in general, especially if you're gardening and doing homesteading things. Make sure you're up to date on that. Now, here is what I ended up doing for the remainder of them. I had to buy a specialty tool for it, one that I didn't already own, which I talked about in my last video when I was building my rabbit poop fence, how I'm trying to not just buy tools when I need them for a new project, because every project has a new tool that I could use. But I found that these hog rings here, and then the hog ring pliers to attach them, worked really well. So I was able to cut the tines off, so I had a little bit of excess waste there, but then was able to attach them, and it made it really nice and clean. So I would recommend that. I think it just looks a little bit neater, better, sturdier than having the wires wrapped around, but works perfectly fine. That's how they were growing up when I was using them as a kid, so they definitely work and they definitely last. Now, once you have it all together, you can either be done or you can cut off a ring to make little pointed stakes to go in the ground. So here you can see maybe where I've got these tines right here, and these will be what go in the ground to support the cage. And if your garden isn't in an area that gets a whole lot of wind, pretty well protected, the tines alone are going to be enough to support the cage. If you get a lot of wind and you're growing some really big tomatoes, you might need a stake to support it. And if you're going to do the stakes anyway, maybe don't cut that ring off, because eventually those will wear out. They'll break off over time. If you like the stakes, they break off over time, you could always just cut another ring, make it a little bit shorter, and they just get shorter and shorter and shorter. Eventually, tomato cages can turn into pepper cages if they're the right diameter. So they last a long time. You can get a lot of use out of them. But if you don't want to have those spikes on there, you can just set it up, run in a stake next to it, and then have a zip tie, a wire tie, something to hold it up in place to keep this thing from moving around. But if you don't have a lot of wind, these stakes enough in the ground are more than enough to keep this thing upright. But this right here is what I think is the ultimate tomato cage. If you have ideas for improving upon this design, please let me know in a comment down below. If you disagree and have a different idea of what the best tomato cage is, let me know. I'm always down to learn new things. As I said, is the first time that I've been gardening on my own. I'm trying a lot of new ideas and techniques. But this cage right here, I have to say, is something that I have more than 30 years experience with and can tell you it works, and it works well. Until next time, my name is Tyler Lloyd. I make videos currently about turning my backyard into a small urban-ish homestead. If that interests you, be sure to subscribe. But I wish you the very best. See you later. Bye.